A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. I'd like to learn more about polar opposites in spiritual proclamations. This is an example. There is good on one side and bad on the other, light on one side, darkness on the other, spirit on one side, and flesh on the other. Those who live according to the flesh have their mind set on what the flesh desires, but those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their mind set on what the Spirit desires. Romans chapter 8. Anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them that makes them stumble. But anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. 1 John 2. When you read these proclamations and Jesus' analogy here about good trees and bad trees, you get the idea that there are two opposing sides and not really a spectrum in between that blends the two. It's either all or nothing, one pole or the other. You jump from one side to the other like a line that says you are in bounds or out of bounds. This is the typical style of proclaiming a spiritual truth. The problem is that it often does not square with our own spiritual experience. Rather than being wholly on one side or another, we find ourselves in a great many ways to be somewhere in between. But in the style of opposing spiritual truths, the in between is a no man's land. I like to think of myself as having a mind set on what the Spirit desires, but I also freely admit that my mind is often dwelling on fleshly things. I believe I love a great many people authentically, but I also freely admit that there is no love lost on certain people in the world or in my life. And yes, bad fruit has been plucked from my branches. All of this would be evidence to living on the wrong pole. If I've got bad fruit, then the only possible option is that I'm a bad tree. The other problem with the stylized spiritual truth of polar opposites is that it is so easily leveraged against well-meaning people who are in fact spiritually sensitive, caring, considerate individuals with loads of concerns and difficulties. Less well-meaning people, at the least, badly misguided people, or at the worst, control-oriented, abusive people, use these proclamations against sincere spiritual seekers to produce fear, guilt, and shame, and establish interpersonal, emotional, and physical control. In the immediate context of talking about good trees and bad trees, Jesus calls out these malicious people. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will know them. Matthew 7. Talk about opposites. And it seems that these people are the ones who discount their own bad fruit by denying it, justifying it, or gaslighting it, while at the same time emphasizing your own bad fruit as evidence that you are not really a good tree, that you should be very concerned for your soul. There is a constant shadow of suspicion and doubt cast over you about whether you live in the light or have your mind truly set on what the Spirit desires. This is, of course, very effective because you want very much to live in the light and move towards what the Spirit desires. You try to be a good tree bearing good fruit, but you just can't trust that you are a good tree because, well, that would be too much confidence. If you were to entertain such a thought, suddenly you are arrogant. What this really means, however, to the wolf in your life is that you are less controllable. Self-assurance is labeled arrogance. Confidence and expressing yourself is slandered as aggression. Because if the light were to really shine through you onto the wolf in your life, you would see what kind of tree this person really is. Perhaps this is the reason for spiritual truth to be proclaimed in opposing terms. It is meant to expose something or someone bad trying to pass itself off as good. The spiritual proclamation of polar opposites creates dissonance. I want to be a good tree, not a bad tree. And so when my fruit is bad, I want to change. Not my appearance, but my roots, my heart, my mind. And God happens to be in the transformation business. Rather than denying the reality of being somewhere in between, these polar opposite statements affirm your and my real life experience. Being in between is not a comfortable place to be. It is distressing because we find ourselves in constant movement towards one direction or another. God pulls us with his love, and our selves, our fears, our triggers, our trauma, our ignorance, our possessions, and our attachments, they pull us away from that love. But a wolf doesn't pull you towards the side of light and love. Quite the opposite. With a wolf, nothing you do will ever be enough. Every mistake is analyzed. You learn to conceal, and you learn to never question the fruits of the wolf. God, on the other hand, has already made you enough. He has already given you enough. His love is enough. And your burdens of guilt, shame, fear, and trauma are constantly lifted so that you can keep moving towards him. You have a voice, and God celebrates you whenever you use your voice to reveal both the good and the bad in your life and in your heart. You don't have to conceal because you are safe and you're already loved, and God is not afraid of anything that you put on the table. So, you may not have an actual person in your life who is a wolf, but you may belong to a wolf pack community. If your church can be described more like a wolf in sheep's clothing than a place of safety and encouragement to be who you are, this church will not help you move closer to the light and to the Spirit. It is pulling you in an opposite direction. How will you know? If your church claims to be in the light and in the Spirit and have no darkness in it, and tends to characterize other churches as full of bad trees from which you cannot trust their fruits at all, then you've got a wolf pack in sheep's clothing. And if you've been eating bad fruit for a while, then it can be pretty hard to recognize it as bad fruit. But if this is making sense to you, you've got some good fruit that other people need. And there are good trees out there that can give you the good fruit that you yourself need. There are people in your life who will recognize your good fruit and can understand the bad fruit also. They will treat you like the good tree God created you as, and they will help you to be more of that tree.